Hi everyone, and welcome to A Quick Chai With. I'm Fahana Jamil.
And I'm Dina Vicaria, and we're thrilled to launch this podcast during South Asian Heritage Month on Prime.
For the first time ever in the UK, South Asian Heritage Month is being recognised and celebrated across the country from the 18th of July to the 17th of August. We're really proud of the fact that Pearson, via Prime, gets to be leaders in recognising the importance of this month for their colleagues. So we're just so excited to have this platform to explore South Asian issues for the first time ever.
So for our first episode today, we have Ishan, Cader and Mahamoda Ali. So we're going to go around the table, and I would like for you to all to tell us a little bit about yourself and what South Asian heritage you identify as. I'm going to start us off. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a global community manager for NEO, and I've been at Pearson just over 13 years now. I identify as British Indian. My mum was born and raised in India. My dad was born in India but raised in Uganda. My family then took refuge in the UK when my dad and my family, like many others, were told to leave Uganda during Idi Amin's time in power. So that's a little bit about my background and how we kind of settled into the UK.
I'm Fahana Jamil. I'm a senior content production manager in BNA, and I'm also the Prime Marketing and Comms co-lead. I guess I identify as Indian Pakistani, which is not normally a label that people go for, but my dad's from Delhi and my mom's from Karachi. And obviously I'm British. So I think for me, I've been actually quite proud of kind of like managing those two sides of my identity. And it's actually kind of given me a really balanced view of British South Asian life.
My name's Ishan, and I work in Pearson Higher Education Qualifications. I just joined Pearson in January. In terms of my identity, I'd identify as British Sri Lankan, and my parents are actually from two different ethnicities within Sri Lanka. So my mum is Sinhalese Buddhist. Sinhalese are let's say the majority group in Sri Lanka, and my dad's from a minority Muslim community. So I've grown up in a fairly pluralistic household, I would say, and my parents moved over to the UK in the 1970s, and I was born and brought up in West London. And I lived in areas that were always predominantly South Asian, so I've had a lot of interaction with different members of South Asian communities as well. So that's been an interesting part of how I've formed my kind of broader identity, I would say.
So my name's Mahamoda, Mahamoda Ali. I work at the Royal Academy of Engineering as Head of Sustainable Development. And I guess my work is closely tied with international development and working towards meeting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So particularly passionate about that. My background and what I identify as is British Bangladeshi. Both my parents were born in Bangladesh, technically East Pakistan, I guess, but came here when they were very young. My dad when he was about 10, my mum when she was about 16, and I was born and brought up in London in a very Western, kind of predominantly white environment, actually. So a little bit different to Ishan mentioning how he grew up predominantly around more Asian people.
Great, thanks guys. So I'm going to go straight into what were your first thoughts when you first heard about South Asian Heritage Month happening? For me personally, I was shocked that we didn't already have this in place. But then actually when you start looking into the history and the contributions of South Asian culture to Britain, much like the West African population and that came through Windrush, we really have contributed a lot to what is modern day British culture. So I actually finding like we were being seen. So yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts and how you felt about it.
Yeah, I was a bit like you. I was kind of surprised that there hadn't been anything existing before. I grew up in a period where, you know, when I remember when Goodness Gracious Me first started in the late 90s, that was like quite a big thing because it was the first time there was real, let's say, visibility for South Asian comedy on the BBC and kind of the mainstream environment. So I think somehow for me, South Asian culture and heritage is subsumed under perhaps broader Black identity, not necessarily just Caribbean. So yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's a positive step that there's now something distinct for that South Asian contribution to be acknowledged and more widely understood in the community.
You just reminded me of Goodness Gracious Me, and I remember as a kid running around going, kiss my chuddies to everyone, because that was the line. And the other one was, what was it? It was Rasmalai. Like,
Yeah.
it just reminded me of a really cool program that used to come on TV, and we literally religiously watched that show, because you're right, it was something that we could identify with and resonate with in terms of our culture and our background and where we came from, because we didn't have that much of it. I remember growing up and seeing, like, on EastEnders, there used to be like Geeta and Sanjay on EastEnders, and it was like really cool to have like that kind of representation on TV.
It's interesting now though, because that stuff is actually really cringe. I feel like I have to put that disclaimer. Like, a lot of brown people now, I don't know, Mahamoda, back me up. I feel like Goodness Gracious Me now is like, oh, that's a very limited view of what we have to offer. And I think it's also this sadness that we can only really express ourselves through humor. And you couldn't necessarily, I mean, even this new show, A Suitable Boy, it's been, you know, kind of showcased as a all brown, all Asian cast. But when you actually look at the people who've written the script, they're still, I think, white writers. So I think there's this whole issue really that comes out of this, is like, what is actual South Asian representation on TV, and how far have we actually really moved? But that's, Mahamoda, tell us how you feel about this question.
Yeah, I think if you look at it now, then yes, I agree with what the sentiment that you just portrayed there. But I guess at that point, I just was also just reminded how much pride we all took. Like, oh, look, it's something, you know, my mom could watch it with us. We were all kind of laughing at different jokes.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was something that did unify kind of the different cultures. You know, I'm not Indian, but I definitely felt like I could relate to it. I grew up watching Indian movies. My mom speaks Urdu. Like, you know, it was something I was just like, oh yeah, that's a bit of me. Now you're just like, yeah, I guess maybe that was one way to get some sort of airtime. I feel like Mira Sayal and, was it Sanjeev
Bhaskar?
Yeah, Bhaskar.
Yeah.
That wrote it. I guess, like, from what I've read, they also struggled and they did what they could to kind of get visibility. But right now we'd expect a lot more from somebody that was making the same attempts.
Definitely. And just to bring you back to the question, in terms of how did you feel when you heard about South Asian Heritage Month then?
Yeah, I mean, I thought similar to you guys that I can't believe this hasn't been celebrated before, but I also thought what a great opportunity to kind of explore into like our diverse and rich culture, and that usually gets clumped in as one, and it's very diverse, and you know, sometimes there's very little in common between different South Asian cultures. And I was also thinking a little bit about, now that it is a kind of annual thing, that perhaps it will provide a different narrative to younger South Asians growing up.
Definitely.
And the pride that perhaps was sometimes lost back 10, 20 years ago, that, you know, we could actually contribute, and we do contribute to this society in the UK, and we've been part of making it great, you know, the Great Britain that we have.
Well, I'm going to move the dial a little bit in terms of the question here. So a couple of things that I struggled with growing up being Indian was that my culture was something that I really kind of grappled with a lot. And my mum was, and pretty much still is, a little hard on me because we both have very, very different views. She's proper old school. And I remember yelling at her, like, you know, if you didn't want me to be so Western, you shouldn't have brought me to like London, you should have stayed in India. And it made me resent, you know, being Indian, because I thought I had to act a kind of certain way. I mean, the worst were the aunties at the weddings who, you know, told my mum that I'm never going to find a husband because I'm so fat, and like I won't amount to anything because I don't have a university degree. And I guess over the years, as I got older and more comfortable with who I am and what I believe in, I learned to really appreciate where my family comes from. I appreciate the music and the food and the dance and the clothes. You know, I love being Indian, and I really wish that I found my culture at a much younger age rather than in my kind of mid-20s. What's one of the worst or the best things about growing up British South Asian? And did you come up against any challenges, whether that's at school or in the workplace when you were younger, with your culture?
I mean, from my perspective, I think, it's a really complicated issue, isn't it, about how you begin to familiarize with the culture of your parents and being that, that second generation. I think for me, I grew up first of all in Southall, which at the time, in the early 80s, was already pretty much 100% Asian, and specifically Punjabi Sikh. I then moved not far away to Hayes, and then where I went to school, a lot of my friends were Gujarati Hindu, and a bit like you, Dina, their parents had come from Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. So actually, they were kind of like, they were double detached, because their parents didn't even really know India; they knew East Africa. So although I grew up around a lot of Asians, my own Sri Lankan community was actually quite small. As I said, my parents are from two different ethnicities, and their friends, just to put it in context, they worked in the airport industry in Colombo in the 70s. So the friends that they have here are their friends that kind of moved over at the same time. They all settled around Heathrow Airport, and they represent quite a diverse community of Sri Lanka. There's a lot of Christians, Tamil Hindus, and they were really kind of united by their English speakingness. And I would even go as far as to say they were kind of Anglophile in their outlook. I think they see themselves and saw themselves as quite integrated into British society. Although ironically, they don't really have that many English friends per se. So I kind of always knew myself as a Sri Lankan, but I didn't feel, unlike my Gujarati friends, but they had a very strong Gujarati community around them in Harrow and Wembley, and a deep culture that they were involved with on a kind of weekendly basis. There was always cultural events to attend, even things like Indian films. For me, I think Mahamoda made the point about there's a lot of difference between South Asian communities, and one of those things is that I don't really know anything about Bollywood culture, for example, because it's not that popular in Sri Lanka. It's obviously in a completely different language that Sri Lankans themselves don't understand. So it was quite a different experience, and I think one of the key things for me is that my parents, being from different ethnicities in Sri Lanka, they spoke English to each other as a British language. So I never really learnt my mum's language, which is Sinhalese, and that was a barrier and continues to be a barrier for me for accessing true Sri Lankan culture in some ways, I think. And I think like you, it took me longer to become familiarized and proud of and have a slightly better understanding of that history of Sri Lankan culture. So yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated because, within Sri Lanka, I'm already a kind of minority. And then within the South Asian community here, I was also a minority as well, let alone being a minority in general in the country. So yeah, that would be my experience.
I can relate to some of those feelings of like resentment that growing up, especially at the younger kind of primary school age. I always, I think I only just remembered as I was listening to you guys talk that I hated going to weekend kind of Islamic schools and then Bengali schools, and I just resented not being able to have a free weekend like all my other friends. And so the older I got and the more vocal I became, I started pushing it all away because I associated it with no fun and no freedom. And after like primary school age, I actually I think I didn't face as many challenges and feeling like conflicted between the two cultures in my secondary school. I went to a very multicultural, inclusive school, and it introduced me to something I'm so grateful for, to the arts, at a very young age. And I felt like I wasn't so aware of the conflicts between like my Bengali culture and like what I was being taught at school. My friends were really open. We bonded on something beyond kind of our cultures and what we had in common or not. But I guess I definitely associated Bengali culture as a negative for a long time, because it just felt so difficult to kind of fit into it. And I felt like I was a little bit more Western than all my mum's kind of friends' children who were based in East London, and I grew up in Maida Vale, and there weren't that many Bengali communities, and if there were, they were kind of just their own families, and I was kind of felt like an outsider. So I'd rather just stay at home, read books, watch Dawson's Creek, and not really be part of that. Looking back on it now, I can see, if it was an environment where it was a little bit more kind of welcoming to kind of have your opinions about the Backstreet Boys rather than talking about I don't know what it is that the kids were talking about. I definitely just didn't feel like I could relate to a lot of Bengali kids that I was being introduced to through my mum and my family. But yeah.
So a funny story, I used to have to go to Gujarati school on a Saturday. So much like you, I also was made to go to those. And it was my birthday, it fell on a Saturday. So I remember writing a contract and making my dad sign it, which meant that he had to let me not go to Gujarati school that day so I could go out with my friends to the cinema. But I wrote an actual contract and I made him sign it.
Funny.
It's really interesting. I think it's one of those things where when something is pushed on you by your parents, you run in the other direction. So for me, contrary to that, no one told me I had to go to Quran school, but no one told me to there were no Urdu classes or anything. So I sought that out myself at GCSE level. So I dropped French and took on Urdu because I really wanted to connect with my culture, so it's really interesting because maybe it's one of those things. But I think it was much later in life that you actually learned to appreciate that being brown is awesome and all of this stuff. I think the thing we forget is that we're not first generation, and we are also British. So in a way, we're kind of mutants, and I think we should celebrate that. I think we're allowed to be two things or more at the same time, and we shouldn't put that pressure on ourselves to fit into that society. But I think we all did that, but I think that was the trick that we kind of missed, or no one actually told us that. And I think if we were able to appreciate those two sides and celebrate them as they were, we would have been a lot happier. But I think we do that now, and we're trying to make sure the next generation doesn't feel that way. And hopefully with insightful talks like this, other people understand South Asian culture a little bit better as well. But yeah, do I need to answer the best and worst thing? I think honestly the best thing right now, personally for me, so kicking off my writing again and being part of South Asian poetry circles, that's really connecting me with my culture, and that's just coming out with so much richness and dealing with subjects like intergenerational trauma, but also kind of finding the magic in South Asian culture and across all the different diaspora and everything. That's really giving me a lot of pride in my heritage right now. But yeah, I think some of the worst things that we really could leave behind and we don't need to take into the next era is things like colorism. As you said, Dina, this whole obsession with the body of women, and you've got this whole Netflix series right now, matchmaking or whatever, which is just really showing the worst sides of the things that we don't need to take on. But I think British South Asians actually are in a beautiful position of kind of celebrating the good things, because there's a lot of good things, and then anything that we don't need to take on, we really don't need to. So that's how I see it. Okay, so actually that's a great segue into the next question. So what's the one thing that you wish you knew about South Asian culture that would have changed the way that you view things now?
I mean, I think it's just a little bit the little bit of education that I'm giving myself about kind of the contributions, at least Bangladesh made to kind of wars, how they gained their independence, how families migrated to the UK. Just knowing the story really helps in kind of providing that context. And I wish I knew that, because if the pride that my parents, my family took in being Bangladeshi, and the way that I just brushed it off as if it was nothing. I mean, it's kind of disrespectful now I look back on it. And I wish I had just known, and I wish they had maybe they did try to educate me and I just pushed it away. But I just feel like I should know that, and that should have been at school as well, not just my parents trying to tell me or me trying to find out myself. But why am I here in the UK? How did we end up here? If Bangladesh is so great. Why did they move to the UK? You know, a little bit of that narrative would have really helped. And now I think we're all old enough to have these conversations. Back then, you know, that community didn't exist. They were just trying to fit in. They were trying to like make the most of their lives. And so perhaps having that visibility would have been really useful to kind of feel a little bit more pride in being Bangladeshi, being South Asian, and so on.
I have to say that I think that there are certain things to do with, you know, if I think, oh, I wish I knew about the language, for example, that's quite a major thing. And I think that would have certainly given me a better connection with Sri Lanka itself. You know, just very basic things like going on holiday there and being able to communicate with people. On the flip side of that, I don't really know whether if my parents had explained to me more about their experience when I was younger, whether that would have impacted me. I think that there's a certain amount that I think that as children, you know, children seek conformity anyway. Do you know what I mean? And I wonder whether actually sometimes we beat ourselves too much about having to understand everything about our identity and background. And you know, it's okay to let it flow. It's okay to understand that you will change over time, because you will do that in any case, whether you're a minority or not. You know, there's definitely an added level of complexity. But what I've found is that amongst my friendship group, I've got a real diversity of how different South Asians have treated their identity. And it's not really to do particularly with which background they're from in South Asia, but more to do with them as an individual. Like, to put it bluntly, I have a lot of South Asian friends who just don't care about it at all. They've been educated in the country, they have strong links to their community, but they went to university, they studied, I don't know, law and finance, and they've done really well for themselves, and they just kind of get on with their lives, right? There's other friends I've got, particularly the ones that I've met through my academic studies, because I went on to do a master's and a PhD in my subject area. And obviously in that kind of circle of friends, people do dwell a lot more on issues of identity and class to an extent. And I find it amongst that group of friends, there is more thinking about identity. So I think you know, it really varies from person to person, from family to family, about what that identity means to them. And I'm cautious in terms of thinking about a message to the next generation and what should be imparted and what shouldn't be imparted. I think a lot of it is down to, yeah, of course, I mean, the minority community in general, but also the South Asian community has changed so much since I was young. And the second generation at my age is now, you know, now the third generation is being born, right? But at the same time, there's other South Asians who have had later migrations into the country, and for them, the second generation is still a thing. And I think it's really quite complicated to navigate. But at the same time, I think there are certain things that will always be the case, and I think it will always be the case that as we grow older as individuals, we will start to appreciate that history and background more and more. And I think that's partly just a human, not necessarily confined to being a minority or not.
Yeah, and I think for me as well, like when I was thinking about this question, like I was exposed to some of the best parts of my culture growing up. I mean, and the worst, right? Like with all the kind of chit chat with the aunties that I call them. But like, you know, I did get exposed to some of the best parts. I just wish that I knew that there was so much more to our culture than what was used as an excuse to behave in a certain way or to act a certain way. And I wish that I didn't conform to those things, and I wish that I'd ignored those things, because I think that I would have really enjoyed taking part in our community events and things like that. And you know, we have those events. Ishan mentioned earlier, we have quite a few events that we do and we celebrate, and I chose to not partake in any of those things because I wanted to kind of stay away from all of that. And I wish that I didn't do any of that, and I wish that I didn't listen to those people that were very negative towards me. And I think that's one of my regrets when I was growing up, was listening to all of those people.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with, you know, everything that you guys are collectively saying. I think shows like Never Have I Ever on Netflix really do kind of cover the conflict that I think a person has when they are Black or a person of color and then also British, because you're trying to kind of manage these two identities. And I take Ishan's point that some people don't even think about it at all. But I think more and more recently, I think people have started to celebrate their South Asian culture and understand the kind of magic and the power that it does actually have. And Dina, as you said, that some of the stuff that we saw growing up was actually a distorted version of the culture. I don't think it was actually like its best, or what potential it could actually have. And that's something we've actually learned growing up for ourselves. As Mahamoda said, learning that, educating yourself about contribution to Britain, or how you've kind of what a great nation you were, and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's those two parts of your identity, and you're allowed to celebrate both. But I think it is kind of, there are certain things that I think certainly would have helped me when I was younger to not necessarily not run away from the South Asian culture. But I think when you're navigating and the mainstream is white mainstream, there is a conformity, as Ishan says, that kids are just always going to lean towards. So skipping into the next question, who are your South Asian role models, and why?
So for me, one of my main role models is a cricketer. Actually, no surprises given that I'm Sri Lanka, and his name's Kumar Sangakkara, and he played for Sri Lanka kind of between, I think, 2000 and 2015. And he's an internationally regarded cricketer, one of the greatest the country's produced, and he's been a really important voice in terms of bridging the gaps and the fissures that have developed between different groups in Sri Lanka in the last kind of 30 odd years, to be honest, because there was a major civil war for a long time, from the early 80s till 2009, and even though that war has finished, the post-war settlement has been very uneasy in terms of ethnic tensions, and I think Sangakkara is, he's from the main Sinhalese Buddhist majority. So for him to talk about unity amongst different people, and the kind of, let's say, the leading by example, which I'm afraid a lot of the politicians in Sri Lanka don't do, as a sportsman and as a kind of a figure that the country's really proud of, because of his sporting achievements on a global stage. It means a lot to, I think, Sri Lankans that want to stop thinking in terms of the tribal identities of the island, and more as a kind of unified nation. And I think he also brings a great deal of pride to the diaspora communities in UK and Australia and Canada and the United States as well. Again, because not just the message that he puts across, but because of his achievements on an international stage. And he was invited to give a talk at the MCC, which is the kind of, I guess, the posh bastion of colonial cricket history, if you know what I mean. And they've always had an annual address to talk about the game, and he used that platform really to talk about unity and in some ways the perils of nationalism to a certain extent, and I guess the use of sport as a bridge between all those different communities. So for me, he's done a lot of great work in terms of offering up a genuine Sri Lankan role model.
For me, I think Riz Ahmed really embodies kind of, he's like, the way he's trying to break the image of what Asian people are seen as. Like, they're not in the arts, they're not like creatives, they're not rappers, they're not actors. I think it's brilliant what he's achieved, and he's been a part of such good content as well. He's always also like kind of picking projects that I love, because they're not the goodness gracious me stereotypes. He always goes for something completely different. And that's just always a real joy for me to see, and like really inspirational. And one thing I really like about him is that he really thinks about kind of identity and what it is to be British. And of course, we know that from his like recent record of The Long Goodbye, which addresses his relationship as a British South Asian and Brexit, and what do you do when your own country rejects you, because he sees England as his country, right? Which I think is just one of those things, again, that I think a lot of people who are Black and brown, other like English races, white races may see you as like, oh, your allegiance is probably to like India or to Pakistan. And it's like, actually, no, because if you drop me there today, I wouldn't actually know how to survive. And, you know, it's that whole thing again about identity. I think he does it beautifully. And yeah, I think generally it's his activism. So I relate to that part because he's always talking about how his rap music and his music in general is his activism, and acting is kind of his way of trying to broaden the discussion about South Asian representation. So in that way, I also see the D&I work that I'm helping with in Pearson through Prime or Will is kind of the joyous part of explaining and educating to people. And then the poetry side of me, or the playwriting side, is the activism. And that's where we're trying to push those narratives that you never ever hear. And you kind of get to be a bit unapologetic. So that's why he's an icon for me.
In that same vein, actually, do you know what? I actually was going to say someone else, but when you were talking about Riz, you reminded me of somebody else that I really admire and is absolutely funny, but in the most amazing way. So Hassan Minhaj, right?
Yes.
I think he's freaking hilarious. But you know what I love so much about him is the Patriot Act, because I'm not very good at like the whole politics, and like I know enough to obviously, you know, vote and do all those things and make a really informed choice, but the way he explains those things on his show, and it through humor and through, you know, facts and everything that he's saying, like I really admire that, for him to bring that kind of side of the world to the masses a little bit, and in a way that helps us to be able to digest the information. Because I can always watch one of his shows and walk away having learned something new and like change your perspective, or whatever it is. But I really admire him for bringing that kind of television program, especially as he's obviously Pakistani as well. So it's nice to have like that kind of representation there as well on screen.
So
that's me.
This is the awkward thing. Hassan Minhaj is Indian.
Is he?
Yeah. And this is the thing that I often get as well, because my dad's Indian Muslim, and people just assume if you're Indian, you're Muslim. Like, you can't be Indian Muslim. You have to be Pakistani.
So I know his wife is Indian, right?
His wife is Hindu,
Hindu,
yeah. But he is Indian Muslim.
Muslim.
So that's why actually the thing, yeah, you learned something today, didn't
I learned something today.
So for me, but the reason why I do love Hassan Minhaj as a choice for you is you know, I agree. When he actually, I love his objectivity. I don't think he like has an allegiance. So even though he is Indian, he did that episode on Indian elections and how corrupt they are, and I loved him for that. Like, he wasn't necessarily like, oh yeah, you know, my heritage is from this, so I'm not going to go for them. He did, because he goes for everybody, and he says this all the time. He's like, I'm just, you know, like a messenger. I'm objective. I'm a reporter. I'm giving you the facts. And that's regardless of like what my background is. So actually that's actually one of the brilliant things, and that's why that episode got so many viewings, is because he technically kind of, you know, put everything out there. And I think he even puts a segment in there where his parents, there's like a little sketch, and they're like, please don't do this because we have relatives there and they're gonna hate us. And he's like, no, it's happening because we need to like pull the lid off this stuff. So yeah, he's a brilliant choice.
Mine is not so kind of out there in terms of compared to like Hassan Minhaj and Riz Ahmed, but mine is actually Nobel Peace Laureate Muhammad Yunus. So he's a Bangladeshi economist who completely disrupted an industry by starting microfinancing through his grassroots Grameen Bank. And this really resonates with me because my past 4 years I've been working really closely on entrepreneurship in kind of developing and emerging economies, and he really champions entrepreneurship, and specifically by giving small loans to very poor people, and specifically 97% of the people that he gives loans to are women. So that trust and confidence building and changing an economy by having really micro loans. I mean, we're talking about £1, £2 making such a big difference to people's lives. And this has been going on for years now. And he hasn't given up on that kind of social entrepreneurship aspect, doing something not to make money, but to solve problems. And I think it's so rare to have somebody from Bangladesh just be in the news, but to make such a big impact all around the world. Because since then, you know, all developing countries, even Western developed countries, have taken on this kind of idea of microfinancing. So for me, it's him. Probably not as well known kind of in our circles, but for me, a real kind of icon.
But I think that's exactly the kind of people that we should also be like celebrating and learning about, because it's not necessarily just celebrities, right? It should also be people who are on the ground and making actual change in community. So no, that's awesome. I'm sure people will go look him up now. What was his name? Mohammed Yunus.
Mohammed Yunus,
Yeah.
Awesome. So, okay, we're going to go into a quick fire round now, which is don't think about it too much. I'm just going to ask a question and then you're going to shout out your answers to me. So, the first question is, what is your favorite South Asian sweet treat? Mine is gulab jamun with ice cream. Hands down, the best. Laddus. Yeah.
I think it's barfi for me.
Oh, good choice.
Or maybe halwa. I don't know.
Oh, that's a good one.
Interesting. I think for me, I mean, me and Dina were talking about this at length before. So I think it's either rasmalai or it's this thing called patisa, which some people don't know, but it's a really nice flaky gram flour thing with pistachios. I'm not explaining it very well. I'll try and add pictures later under when you post this, Dina. I'll post a link.
Awesome. Okay, so my second question is a favorite South Asian film that you would recommend. Now, this is really hard for me to choose because I am like self-proclaimed Bollywood queen. I have lots of favorite Bollywood or South Asian movies, but Bollywood in particular because I am hardcore. But the one film that I have watched over and over again and I can watch over and over again is Hum Saath Saath Hai. And I will put links in the description.
Kidding?
I bloody love that film.
I hate that film.
Oh my god!
But that's fine. I really thought you were going to say K3G, but okay.
Oh, you know what it is? I can watch Hum Saath Saath Hai and I cry every time at the given parts that you got to cry in.
Awful. There's
no
scripts. But no, that's fine. That's you. Everyone else, what are you going to say?
So I'm going to put forward a film called The Warrior, which I actually saw not that long ago with the recently departed Irfan Khan. And it's actually directed by a British Bangladeshi Asif Kapadia. So it's an interesting thing because it's a British Asian director, but it's an Indian production and set in India. And for also just to add a really good series that I've seen, Patal Lok, which is great. If you've got Prime, I'd thoroughly recommend that.
So if I'm going to be cool and recommend a really kind of indie film, I'd say The Lunchbox, also with Irfan Khan. Really touching kind of film and so clever, the way that it's directed and the script and so on. But if I go back to when I did kind of actively watch Bollywood movies, it's going to be an oldie. It's Hum Aapke Hain Kaun.
Oh, that's a great one.
I mean, I think I watched that film when I was younger, like on repeat. Like I must have watched it over 100 times. And I just wished I was Madhuri Dixit then.
Yeah.
And I think still, because she's still
classic. It's a classic.
She doesn't age. She just doesn't age. Have you seen her recently? Oh,
yeah, she doesn't.
Beautiful.
So, yeah, the songs on that and the like humor and comedy and yeah, it's pretty cool.
Awesome. And Farhana, what about you?
I love, like, film is something that I wish I studied. So for me, this is an impossible question. I don't know why I wrote it down. I think in the interest of our listeners going off and finding this stuff, I'm actually really going to recommend something I saw recently called Gully Boy, which is I think was nominated for an Oscar for Best Foreign Film and is on Prime right now, Amazon Prime, and it's a brilliant story. It actually has a female director, Zoya Akhtar, and the whole story is about a gully boy, so a working class dude from like Delhi, and he's trying to just make it as a rapper, but it's his journey to get to that. And initially I really thought this was going to be a contrived movie, and I put it on with like all the kind of misgivings, and then actually it's so good because it's his journey as a poet into rap music, which is poetry, but it really, really is brilliant, and how they show like the intersections of him being Muslim and also working class, and just all the barriers that he has in life. But it's actually a really beautiful film, and the poetry in it is actually really excellent. So Gully Boy is the film that I'm going to go for.
Nice, nice. And then final question is, how do you like your chai? Now, I am very particular. So the tea bag can only be in there for 10 seconds, and then it has to be taken out, and the milk has to be like 2 teaspoons of milk, because I like my tea to be really dark, but the 10 seconds in the hot water only. I don't know why. I don't like it too
Are you
strong.
timing this to the 10 seconds?
Yeah,
or
yeah. I'm like 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 10 seconds, and then the tea bag has to come out. But in that 10 seconds, I'm stirring and I'm squeezing the life out of that tea bag. And then the most minute splash of milk, because we've established in our previous conversation for Hannah that I don't like milk. I don't like drinking milk. The most smallest splash of milk. But the tea color has to be like brown, like dark brownish.
Does it get brown in 10 seconds?
This is what
that's
I'm
'cause
thinking.
it's
This
'cause
was
I
my
squeeze the
follow-up
life out of
question.
it. Oh, I let it the hot water, and then I literally with the back of the spoon, I'm squeezing the life out of that tea bag for 10 seconds.
See, I
Anything
have
more
to
than 10
like
seconds, it starts to
I
get a
have to
bit
like
bitter.
go off and water plants or something and then come back to it because it
Yeah.
needs to be
I like
dark.
it
It
bitter.
needs to be like
Oh, if it's
it
in there
needs
too
to it needs
long,
to
it
wake
gets
me
bitter.
up.
Oh, no, no, no. It has to be like, the right amount. Anyway, that's enough of my tea making. What about you, Ishan?
I mean, I don't really make it that often, but my favorite style of tea is definitely the way they make it in Sri Lanka, which is brewed for a long time with condensed milk and cinnamon and cardamom.
Oh wow, that
Uh,
sounds amazing.
Is that
yeah,
like
it is.
garak?
Sorry?
Is that like garak chai?
Uh,
It's like, is that what they call it there? I don't know if they call it garak. That's the condensed milk is what they call it. They call it garak chai here, and they do it with condensed milk as well.
I think in Sri Lanka there's not that many styles of making the tea, so they just use. And if they can't use condensed milk, it's just milk with lots of sugar, which is weird because in England I don't actually take my tea with sugar, so it's a real treat whenever I go over.
Yeah.
And yeah, and also the coffee that they make is also with condensed milk, so particularly sweet and refreshing.
Amazing.
I've half said how I like my tea. I literally put the tea bag in there and then just go off for like ages and then come back. And you know, garak in Hindi translated into English is like hush, right? It's like
Yeah.
slap bang. It's like it's supposed to wake you up. So that's how I like my tea. It needs to be strong and it needs to like literally like wake you into action. Unfortunately, I also love sugar, so I literally limit myself to 1 tea a day. Mamoda knows this and judges me. Yeah, I think that's how I like my tea. In an ideal world, though, when I have time, the milk has to be warmed up separately and then poured in. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's when you have time, right? That's like a Sunday treat or something.
I think in Sri Lanka they do it together all at the same time, so it's just so good.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Amazing.
Yeah, stop plugging Sri Lanka, all right? Sean, you've got the best tea of all time, all right? No, but it sounds brilliant. I'm jealous. Mamoda?
Yeah, so when I'm in Bangladesh, I mean, the thing that me and my brother look forward to the most is like tea time in the evening. And that is like similar to the way that Ishan's just described the tea, where you have the like actual tea leaves, like kind of, they also almost look like coffee grounds, and they cook that with like full fat milk with loads of sugar, and it's just bubbled for so long, and then it gets all thick, and they do the whole pouring thing so you get bubbles. But we've never been able to recreate that here. I think it's just different tea and different milk. So that's when I'm in Bangladesh, and that is just like syrup. Here, I'm similar to Fahana. I think I like it brewed for a long time. No sugar though, and it has to be powdered, full fat powdered milk. That's like the Bengali in me. That's like a treat. We always use powdered milk, and it has to be the Bengali kind of imported powdered milk, which is Nestle anyway, but you know.
Which is known to you guys as Nestle, but to us it's Bengali powdered milk. I love that.
Awesome. That's really cool. Okay. Well, Ishan and Mahamoda, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope we've managed to share a little bit about our culture with our colleagues at Pearson. And to the people of Pearson, I hope you enjoyed our first episode of A Quick Gyrwave.